I'd like to welcome a longtime writer for the Washington Post, the Sporting News, one of my old-time favorites, the Louisville Courier Journal, the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, to name a few. One of the most magnificent journalists of our generation. He's won the Red Smith Award, the PEN American ESPN Lifetime Achievement Award for sports writing, the Dan Jenkins Medal for Excellence in Sports Writing, author of 9 books, including one of my personal favorites, Sound and Fury, Two Powerful Lives, One Fateful Friendship, Ali and Cosell. He's also a member of the National Sports Media Hall of Fame. Welcome to your show and mine, Bobby Ramos, Bottom Line, the one and only Mr. Dave Kindred. Dave,
Well,
welcome to the show.
thank you, Bobby. My pleasure. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Me too. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming on today and to talk about your most recent work. And I would safely assume probably your most personal work. Leave out the tragic parts, a grandfather's search for a boy lost to addiction. Again, Dave, I have to give you my condolences to the tragic loss recently of your beloved wife and your grandson, Jared, who this book is about, Jared Glenn Kindred. I truly understand the effects of losing loved ones to addiction. My older brother passed away from alcoholism. His son passed away from drug addiction, and my sister also had a massive drinking problem. So as a 27-year cop, I thoroughly understand and have witnessed the pain, worries, dread, and sorrows that permeates through families going through this kind of stuff. So I want to thank you very much, not for just being here today, but for having the courage to write this book.
Well, thank you for all of that, Bobby. It was, I've written 7 or 8 books, but this book, if you can see that, is the only book that I had to write. I could not write this book. I knew the story. I loved that boy, Jared. He lived with us until he was maybe 18, got out of high school, and then was on the road after that. I very seldom saw him. But I loved him in ways that I've never loved anybody or anything. And I kind of did the book in order to say that, try to understand how such a thing could happen. And then his life, it's a life that a whole lot of young people have fallen into and can't get out of. Alcoholism for him, I'm told, probably started when he was 12 or 13 years old. Some brains react differently to alcohol, and apparently he was easily addicted. And I had to find out what happened. I had to know what happened. Just the journalist in me, the reporter in me, the grandfather in me had to know what happened. He was such a darling kid. Everybody loved him, always had fun. And then, for this to happen, and it was happening in front of my eyes, and I didn't really know it. So I had to find out more. Wrote the book. It's the best thing that I've ever written, in the sense that, as you said, it's very personal. It's as personal as it can get. I was hard on myself in the book. I tried to understand. I had to do a lot of research. And my bottom line, the shortest way to say it, is that he didn't choose to be addicted. Addiction chose him. The brain reacts differently. His brain was easily addicted, and he couldn't get out of it. It's not like, hey, boy, you got to stop drinking. Well, he knows that, but he couldn't stop drinking. So it's a long, hard book, and I hope that some people have read it and profited from it. I hope some people learned some things from it.
Before we get into this gripping story of love, worry, regret, in real life, I want to put out there also, as you said, your grandson Jared, he left home at 18 and he began a life of riding train cars and making friends on the street. As you called them in the book, you called them the 21st century, you called them hobos, but they called themselves traveling kids. But all the while, Jared hid that for most of his short life, that he was an addict and he was drinking too much, just like my brother did. But he spent a lot of time with you and your wife. He actually lived with you guys for a while. What kind of young boy was he?
Well, he was always fun. He was always laughing, always being silly. He was telling stories. He had a great memory. He could tell you every second of his day. Um, we rode motorcycles together. It was just the kind of a typical kids growing up. The problem became that he was the product. His father and mother divorced. And some of the book though is also what divorce does to a child. His parents divorced when he was 8 years old, and then he had a brother, a twin. The mother and the father split the boys. One lived with the mother, one lived with the father. What does that do to twins? What does that do to brothers to be separated like that? So it was a long, hard thing. He was most comfortable really with us, with the grandparents. Maybe because we didn't ask much of him. We just wanted him to be comfortable and wanted him to be safe. He was not a good student. I think he had a reading problem. So it was. And when he was 18, his father had told him, "When you're 18, you're not living with us anymore." That's when he came to live with us for a while, and then he disappeared on the road.
Right. That's what I wanted to get into. As a youngster, did you see any signs in him that he might choose anything like the alternative lifestyle that he chose of being a train hopper?
All I ever saw in him, Bobby, was that he was not a conformist. He didn't want to be like everyone else. He wanted to be an individual. He had uh, kind of a heavy metal streak in him, for
Okay.
lack of something better to say. He didn't dress the same way that everybody else dressed. He wanted to be an individual, and this was kind of his way of striking out and being his own person. It was nothing that I would have chosen to do, nothing that most of us would have chosen to do, but it was his way of saying, "This is who I am." And he never fit in, never really fit in with. Well, I learned a long time ago, high school lingo: jocks, the athletes; freaks, the drug people. He never felt comfortable with any of those people. He wanted to be his own person, and this was a way to do it. And I don't really, even though I did all the investigation and the reporting, I never did find out when he first thought it would be a good idea to just roam around America.
The
It
reason
just,
why I asked that, because on page 12, you wrote how he had told his father what he was going to do, that he would be leave and he'd be gone forever. And I wanted to know if he had ever given a reason as to why it's probably some of the things you already said.
well, I think it was the divorce. I think it was a dysfunctional family. I think, my son, his father, remarried, had a second family, had second children, and he felt out of place in his own home.
Right.
If your father says when you're 18 you're not living here anymore, go join the Marines or something,
Gotcha.
you're not wanted. You're not wanted in the family that raised you. And so there's a sorrow there that probably can't be expressed, certainly by a teenager who doesn't know. Imagine being 17 years old and being told, "We don't want you here once you're 18." And so what's he going to do? He found people living on the street, and they took him in, and he felt comfortable with them. He fit there where he didn't fit in his own house.
Right. Yeah, that's deep. On page 33, 34, you went in depth to talk about that situation with his father, and how he had another family, and they split the two twins up. And there was a part in the book where you were talking about how that seemed to be the reason. But later on page 90, when you were speaking to your other grandson, Jacob, he said that wasn't the case. He didn't feel, because you were told that, the boys were always fighting and they weren't getting along. And Jacob said that exactly wasn't the case.
No, what my son was saying was that Jared had to leave the house because he was there was a possibility he was going to hurt the new child in the house.
Right.
And Jacob said that wasn't that at all. They felt they couldn't. The parents, my son and his second wife, didn't think they could handle Jared. That's why they wanted him gone.
Right.
Yeah, they separated the twins at a time in their life when the twins needed to be hugged and embraced. Instead, they were told to go away. So it was a hard thing for Jared to accept, hard thing for Jacob to accept. Jacob did live with my wife and I for 2 or 3 years while Jared was on the road. Jared just left town. But Jacob Jacob didn't have that wandering gene in him. He was also not the alcoholic that Jared was. So it was, Jared just basically just wanted to run away.
Right.
He didn't feel that he was wanted at home. So he was gone. He found people that like him, found people that had the same thoughts of life that he did. And he had fun. It was fun. I mean, every time I said, "Why are you out there, Jared?" "Well, it's fun, Grandpa. It's fun." Well, he was having fun because he was drinking and he was having adventures,
Right.
and so that's what I tried to represent in the book, this alternative lifestyle, this another way of getting through life for him. It was the only way that he could do it.
Right. Take me through the mindset when he told you and your wife Cheryl that at 15 he felt that he was an alcoholic. Take me through your mindset at that time.
Well, we didn't believe it. I didn't know much about alcoholism. I didn't know how it worked. I think I was one of those people who would say, "Well, why don't you just quit drinking?" Well, the truth is you can't just quit drinking. You have to want to do it. You have to want to quit. You have to work at quitting. And he wasn't that person. But when he's 15 years old and he says, "Grandma," he's talking to my wife, "Grandma, I'm an alcoholic." She didn't know what to make of that. Neither did I.
Right.
No, you're not. What are you talking about? We didn't take it seriously. And we should have. And it's one of the lessons in the book, I hope. I say later in the book that if certainly a child, if a teenager tells you he has a problem, deal with it. Deal with it now. Don't say, "Let's get back to that later." If that were to happen now, knowing what I know now, knowing the destructive path, knowing that there is a way out, I'd have insisted when he was 15, "You're not leaving me. You're not leaving this house again. We're going to deal with this now. We're going to do something now. We're not going to do it later. We're not going to wait until you hit rock bottom, because there is no bottom. Everything is going to be worse. Deal with it now. Deal with it strongly. Deal with it immediately." That's what I hope that somebody would understand from this story. Don't let it go.
Right. And that's what I was going to touch on. Another thing about you penning this story, there was also the different situation where your ex-daughter-in-law, Lynn, said that the boy's father, Jeff, he had only called once to see how the boys were doing. And you wrote that you were no longer father and daughter-in-law, that you and Lynn were in this together, partners for the common cause, which was Jared, for who you both loved. And I think that's real key for families who are going through this to understand that within the family, communication is not only key, but it's so important.
My son was in total denial. Or I don't even know what it is, Bobby. I don't even know what to call it. I just know that my son did not want to deal with it. You know, you're 18, you're gone, you're on your own. Well, you can't do that. You know, 18 is no magic time in a person's life where suddenly they become mature and they make mature decisions. You know, how old was I before I made a mature decision? Probably 40. You know,
Right.
he's 18. He doesn't know what he's doing. You know, that's why we're parents. But my son just abandoned him. My son abandoned the grandson. You know, he had the divorce was nasty, so he didn't want to deal with the mother. And so it was left to me in some way to be the father that was missing and try to help. And Lynn, the mother, it's I did this book because I couldn't not do it. The pain is with me, all the time because I loved him. For Lynn, it's as if this happened yesterday, and it's happening again today, and will happen again tomorrow. I felt so bad for her because my son wanted total denial, wanted to be totally removed from the situation, and Lynn wanted to be in it all the time. She would have done anything for that boy, and so I connected with her, a million times more than I connected with my son. My son just didn't care. I mean, I think he cared, but he didn't know how to do it. He didn't know how to care. He was, say, 50 years old, and he still hadn't got fully mature. So why do you think a kid at 18 should be just left on his own?
And part of that's such a big thing with a lot of us males, as far as communicating and opening up a bit. And that's
exactly. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. You had a very powerful line where you said on page 2, talking about Jared, you said he had a home, but he had chosen, as you said, to be homeless, unwashed, unshaven, stinking to high heaven and broke. He had made that choice. As during your research and you found out his street name was Goblin, who gave him that and why?
Well, he was with a traveling friend of his whose name was Booze Cop. They were in a mall, sitting in a mall panhandling.
Okay.
And Jared said to his friend Booze Cop, people are looking at me like I'm some kind of spooky creature. And Booze Cop said, yeah, like a goblin. So he became Goblin. Booze Cop, of course, became Booze Cop. His real name was Nicholas. He became Booze Cop because one night he was telling people that they were drinking too much. And somebody said, what are you, the Booze Cop? So that's how they get their handles, to get their names.
Gotcha.
And so Booze Cop and Goblin were a pair on the road for a long time. Booze Cop I still hear from occasionally on Facebook. He was a great kid. He was more an alcoholic than Jared was, but at least he's still alive.
Right. And now, Jared, how surprised were you for the folks that Jared got a tattoo on his face, kind of like Mike Tyson? What was your response to that?
That I learned about that one day. This was kind of at the beginning of my understanding of what was going on, because I knew he was on the road, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what that meant at all. And Lynn, the mother, called me one day, and she was sobbing and wailing, and I could barely understand her. And she said, Dave, Jared has done the one thing I asked him never to do. And I'm thinking, what did he do? Rob a bank? Did he steal a car? What's happened? She said he's got a tattoo on his face. She says, I've got tattoos on my body, but not on my face. I
Right.
asked him to never do that. And he had this, it was a crude, I say in the book, Mike Tyson probably paid thousands of dollars to get
Right. Right.
this Maori tattoo on his face. Jared's was done by a friend in a motel room who had never done a tattoo before, and
Wow.
with he did it with uh, a toothbrush that had been sharpened to a point and powered by a little model car motor, and he did it like in a mirror with no plan, just started drawing lines around his
Right.
face. It's not quite as ugly as I'm sounding here,
Uh-huh.
um, but it was the sign that I'm done. I'm done with your world, Mom. This is my
Right.
world now. It was a final kind of certification that he was gone. You know, it was the. I'm not sure exactly what I can say on your show, Bobby, but it was like
Say
"F you,
whatever you want.
world."
Right.
I'm gone, and I'm not coming back. And we tried
Right.
to talk to. I even tried to talk to him about getting the tattoo removed. Well, tattoo removal was a long, hard process, and Jared was not in for that. He had made his decision.
Right.
That was
What
the
I want.
first. That was the first time, Bobby, that I realized, okay, this is serious. This is not just a kid who's gone for a couple of weeks vacation and coming back. He'd
Right.
made a decision. He was casting his lot with Booze Cop
Right.
and a woman named Agro, and a woman named Alexi. All of his friends on the road. He had made a decision, and that was his life.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you. You spoke to so many of his train hopper friends. How many did you speak to, ballpark, and how did you contact them?
I probably talked to 20, 25 people who had known
Uh,
Jared, but 30, 35 people who had
and,
known Jared on the road. And I didn't know any of them. When Jared was on the road, I saw him once. I saw him in October before he died in January. The only time that I'd seen him on the road. I thought he looked pretty good. He had a beard. He's obviously dirty because you know, early on, he'd come to our house when he was on the road, and my wife, being the world champion homemaker and a world champion wife, wanted to wash his clothes. Oh no, Grandma, I can't wash my clothes because I got to be dirty or nobody's going to give me any money. So okay, it was a little lesson in life,
yeah,
but
sure is. Yeah.
so I didn't know any of these people. The first time I saw him as a train hopper, as a kid on the road, was in October. 3 years. He'd been gone for 4 years. I talked to him on the phone occasionally, sent him money. Need $19 for the mega bus from Albany to the city. So I'd go to Western Union and send him $19. But I didn't know any of the people on the road. I met Booze Cop, Agro, and Jared in October before he died in January. When he died in January, I went to the funeral, of course. Funeral was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, his mother's home. They all showed up.
Right. Yeah, we're gonna get. I was
It
gonna get
it
into that.
it
That's deep.
it gets emotional for me. That I had never seen these people. I'd
Right.
heard the names, and we're in this funeral home, and they're all there. 20, 25 people. You know, all stinking, all dirty. But it was
But all loving your grandson.
all loving him,
Well, yeah.
all
Yeah.
happy to have known him.
Right.
Sad. Met a girlfriend of his, Maggie. Um,
Yeah, we're gonna get
yeah.
into her.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me ask you this: out of all the things that were relayed to you by his friends about Jared and his lifestyle, give me three things that stood out the most, positively or negatively. Give me the three things that stood out to you the most as you learned about his lifestyle.
Well, I've said, and I don't know if I said it in the book or not, but I would not have done this book. I would not have written this book if in my reporting I had discovered that he was not the Jared that I knew. If I discovered that he was a bum, if I discovered that he was robbing people for money, if I discovered that he mistreated people, I would not have done this book.
Right.
But I discovered that he was. Sorry, I discovered that he was an even better Jared on the road than I had known at home, and
Wow.
he was happy all the time. He was laughing all the time. He was always looking for the next shenanigan, the next adventure. These were not, not destructive adventures, destructive to him, of course, but not destructive in the sense of society. He was just having fun out there.
Right.
He did the same things in New Orleans that I would have done in New Orleans. Go to go have some beignets, walk down Bourbon Street.
Right.
New Orleans was his favorite place. He was, I think, three things. He was always laughing. He was always up for an adventure. He was always fun to be with. No one I talked to had anything bad to say about him. Uh, he would defend his friends. A friend was in trouble. A kid from Chillicothe, Illinois, met him on the street in New Orleans. And Jared immediately befriended him and said, "You need anything, you know where I am." He was always there to help people.
Right. You know, page 47, you were talking about a lot of the physical problems that he went through due to his lifestyle. And he had got hit on the highway by a car doing 75 miles an hour. He had 6 major fractures up and down his leg. His leg being snapped below the knee. Liver was sliced apart. I mean, and he stayed with his mother for a little bit over 100 days in Myrtle Beach. And he couldn't wait to leave. And I was like, wow. But you wrote, and I quote, "Not once did I think of flying there to have a conversation about," and close quote. And I look at that, and you were talking about how you had to do a lot of inner reflection. And you mentioned other times of the book where you seem to look at certain moves that were made towards Jared or not made towards Jared. Do you regret any of that? I mean, nobody's ever perfect about anything, but is there anything you would do differently?
Yeah, and that's part of it. The time that he spent with his mother when he was in rehab because he couldn't walk, um, should have done something then, you know. But the truth is, and I think you know this, Bobby. You've lived on the street. You know enough. You've seen enough that unless the person wants it, you
Yeah,
can't change them.
yeah, that's true.
You can tell them how much you love them. You can tell them how much it hurts you. You can tell them that they're going to hurt themselves. But unless they want to fix it, it can't be fixed, and they have to really want it. And we tried. I never tried. I should have gone to New Orleans. I should have gone to Arizona with her when he was hit by the car.
Right.
That's Jared. I mean, actually, my son should have been doing that, but he
Right.
wasn't going to do it.
Good
I
point.
should have done it because I at least understood what was happening. I should have gone to Myrtle Beach when he was there, and but in the end, it would have made no difference. The alcohol owned him, the addiction owned him. My son did go as far with his second wife as to try to get him into a rehab place in Virginia. They even had him in the car on the way to the place when Jared threatened to open the door and fall out of the car rather than go to the rehab place.
Yeah.
And there was another lesson that I learned is that the detoxification is frightening in itself. They don't want to do that, because the pain is such, the withdrawal. I used to think that that people passed out, had seizures because they drank too much alcohol. The fact is, without the alcohol, when the alcohol is withdrawn, is when the seizures happen, because the brain has become rewired. It needs the alcohol. And without it, the brain goes haywire. That's when, so they're trying to avoid the pain of that. And unless they really want it, and you got it, that's why I say you have to get to them early. My one regret is that when he said at 15, I'm an alcoholic, I should have believed him.
Yeah, that's hard. When you ran into all of his buddies on the road, and they all, as you said earlier at the funeral, which we're going to talk about later, they all loved him and spoke so highly of him. What did you gain from that?
Well, as I said, I gained that he was the same guy. He was a better version of the little kid that I knew. He was the same kid. It was a terrible thing to see. You know that this is going to end badly. Self-destructive behavior. Why is it self-destructive? Why would he want to do that to himself? Well, at some point in time, as one of the alcohol rehab people told me, people drink to change the way they feel. And if you are feeling bad, let's have a drink. And in the end, the brain gets rewired to a place where it demands you're no longer in charge. Your brain is now in charge. It's demanding the change, demanding the nutrient. The brain comes to think of alcohol as a nutrient rather than a destroyer.
Page 84, and you were talking about some of these people. In summer 2011, he was sleeping in the gazebo in Coney Island Boardwalk, and you wrote about there was, of course, a girl, because he always had a hot chick with him, and she was a tall, beautiful Puerto Rican who was also French, 19 years old, Solzy Twitch LeBoy, which is the coolest name. Solzy Twitch LeBoy. I just had to repeat that just for effect. And she always talked about what a people person she was. And I just wanted to read a quote from her. She said, "One thing I admired, he was an addict who didn't put his substance above you. He was a big drinker, alcohol. He wanted his vodka was his poison of choice, but he didn't put his substance above you." Man, me being in the streets with so many people with drug and alcohol addictions, I saw a lot that put their addictions above everybody else. That opened my eyes to hear somebody say that your Jared wasn't that cat at all.
Well, Solzy was one of the great people. I never met her, but I conversed with her, I think, through Facebook. We exchanged a lot of writing. She was very smart, very bright. She loved him. She wanted to be with him, but she knew that was going nowhere. She was smart enough to know that. She was as much an alcoholic as he was. And another thing that I found is that a lot of the women on the road survived. They got out of it.
Okay.
Really? Mainly, I'm not sure why, other than they would become pregnant, they'd become mothers, and that changed them. Solzy is still alive. Solzy is in New York someplace. That's not her name, of course. I forget what her real name is.
Right.
But she was beautiful. She was smart, and I heard that kind of conversation, from so many people about Jared, that again, that's what persuaded me that this was really the Jared that I wished that I had known, the Jared that I knew when he was 8 years old, 12 years old. He became a guy who wanted to help people. He was out there. He wanted to help people, at his own cost. He was, and everybody. And of course, I suppose if I had talked to any of them about another friend, they'd have been just as kind about that as they were about Jared. But I don't think so. I think Jared was a special kid that, I mean, if you just saw him, first of all, if you just saw him, I mean, he wasn't as, he just had this baby face. When he was 25 years old, he still looked like he was 14. He was a little guy, maybe 5'6", 5'7", probably weighed 120 pounds, just goofy. He'd make goofy noises, goofy dances. He was just having fun. And it was a great tragedy. The title of the book, even, the one time that I saw him as a kid on the road was at his father's in Orange, Virginia. And I told them, it was then Agro. Well, I said earlier it was Booze Cop. It wasn't Booze Cop. It was a guy named Jimbo. Agro, Jimbo, and Goblin. And I said, hey, I'm going to write about this someday. I was taking notes through this. I was doing the reporting, when he'd call, where he was. And I'm going to write about this someday. I want you guys to remember everything. I want you to remember everything, tell it to me, and make it funny. And my son was standing there, and he said, leave out the tragic parts. And Jared said, yeah, no tragic.
Wow.
So, 3 months later, we got the call, that his mother said, that's another very dramatic part of the story.
Before we even get there, I got a kick. I just wanted to change it a little bit. Your precious mother was in a nursing home, and I got such a kick out of her because you wrote about how she was such a spunky lady who refused to wear her hearing aid because she felt it wasn't her problem. People just needed to speak up. That's just hilarious to me.
I do that now.
Really? You too? Okay. So that's why when I called you, you didn't hear me at first. Gotcha. But anyway, tell us about your mother's cheese story and how you think it connected with you and the whole train situation.
Well, I didn't know this story. My sister had told me this story. We lived in Atlanta, Illinois, 1,300 people, lived right across the street from railroad tracks. On the other side of the railroad tracks was Route 66, famous Route 66.
Right.
Trains came by our house all the time. Trains would stop. This was in the 40s, 1940s, when I was an infant. But hobos on the trains would come off the trains. They knew to come to our house because my mother would make them cheese sandwiches and put them back on the train, and they would leave town. But they always knew that they could count on Marie to feed them. So it was just one of those kind of writerly stories that I knew nothing about. But oh, really? So there was all these guys were Jared, 50 years before there was a Jared, and the difference was they were looking for jobs in those days. They were going from one town to another looking for jobs. Jared was just out looking for adventure.
A few years go by and Jared was doing his train hopping around the country. He'd been in the hospital a couple of times. The doctors had already told him if he kept drinking, he was going to die. He gets taken to the hospital by an ambulance, and that's where he was diagnosed with tachycardia, which I don't think I'm pronouncing right, but it's a condition that causes the heart to race, sometimes to 200 beats a minute. And while you were talking about this, you mentioned the lady you mentioned, the African-American sister, Maggie, who you said that she was the one that he thought she just had magic. What do you think was Maggie's magic?
What was magic about Jared?
Yeah, no. What was magic about Maggie? He had something different for her.
I'm not sure of that. Other than
you wrote that she was the only one that you thought could help him find his way.
Well, the the most harrowing story in the book, the most harrowing story I heard was when Maggie and Jared went to Houston to pick up a friend and drive that friend's car back to North Carolina. When they were driving from Houston to North Carolina, Jared had seizures, was spitting up blood, was about to die in the back seat of the car. And Maggie is driving, and she is holding him with one hand in the back seat while driving with the other hand. It was a
Right.
devotion to him, to the idea of keeping him alive, that made her special. She was, she was not the alcoholic that Jared was. Certainly, she was an alcoholic, and she had run from home too. So they had this kind of kindred spirit, if you would, relationship, and then they lived together in Mount Airy, North Carolina, uh, in Maggie's mother's house, and that's where, if Jared was going to save himself, he could have. She was willing. Maggie was willing. She'd have married him in a New York minute, she said. They could have. They had plans for some kind of life together. He was doing some carpenter work. He could have done anything. He was a very bright kid. He could have done anything. She wanted to get a job. They wanted to start a life together, but he could not do it. He just couldn't do it. When it came time to make a decision, he wanted to go to New Orleans. She, Maggie, to her credit, said, "I'm not going to New Orleans." And they went north instead of going south, and that ended badly. Where she just couldn't take it anymore. She saw what was happening. She saw that he was going to kill himself, and she just couldn't do it anymore. But that's where I think I say in the book there's several places where you hope maybe he could save himself, but he couldn't. He was not in charge anymore. The addiction was in charge. And Maggie was one of those times when it could have changed his life. Certainly the time after he was hit by the car and rehabbing at home with his mother, he could have saved his life. The third time was when his son, my son, and his second wife wanted to take him to a rehab place. Okay, could have saved himself then, but he couldn't. He just couldn't.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your dad. And this is for the men who are watching this, because we can have so many issues. But in 1963, the doctors found that your dad had a malignant tumor in his stomach. And sad to say, his time was running out. And you wrote very poignantly about this, and I wanted to get this right. And I quote, you said, well, he was at home dying of cancer. And you said, I quote, "I didn't know what to say to him. We had never talked much. Dad was 51, I was 22, and we had lived together without knowing each other. He came from a generation of silent men who left school to work through the Depression and left their families to fight a world war. I was a kid who could read and write, but had not learned to talk. Now Dad was dying, and I wanted to help him. I wanted him to know that I loved him. I didn't know if he knew that. One night he sat at the kitchen table silent. Finally, I put a hand on his shoulder and said, I'll teach my son everything you taught me about baseball. I didn't know how to say I loved him. That was as close as I could come. He said to you, no, you teach him everything you know. You know more than I ever did. That was as close as he would come to me," close quote. In the preface of your book, you mentioned how you made a fool of yourself because you loved your two grandsons, Jared and Jacob, so much. And maybe because you didn't have that relationship with your son, Jeff, dealing with them was going to be like a second chance. For all the men out there, especially with our communication with our especially sons, please speak to, have you ever discussed this with your son, Jeff? Has he gotten better in his communication? Because this stuff for men is generational. It really is.
Yeah, no. So the sad answer is no. I still haven't talked to him. I still haven't had that kind of conversation with him. I don't think he's even read this book. I've told him things that are in the book, things that I thought he needed to know, but I don't think he's read the book. I don't think we've never had that conversation. I don't feel comfortable. Again, there's a sad to say, Bobby, but there's this residual anger in me that my son let this happen, that my son may have caused this to happen. Certainly did nothing to change it course. So there's this kind of residual anger at him that, I had hoped this book would resolve. We talked some about what I felt was my workaholic habits, that I didn't spend as much time with my son as I should have. And he said, no, Dad, you were great, Dad. You were perfect. Look at all these things that we did together and all that. And yeah, we did a lot together, but I still felt that I had not been the father that I should have been. And some of that was because I had never learned from my father what a father was.
Right.
Part of that was, as I said, a generation of silent men, who grew up during the Depression. But also, it's a matter of he died when I was 22. As I said earlier, when did I become mature? 40, 50,
Right.
80? I don't know when. But I didn't know how to talk to my father because he had never talked to me. So if there's a lesson in the book, I don't know if there's lessons or not. I just tried to be honest with what was happening, and I wish that all could have been different. Maybe if I just wanted to know my dad, I wanted to know him. Maybe when I was 17, I didn't care. Maybe then I just wanted to be, a baseball player. I wanted to be a major league baseball player. Maybe that's all I cared about. Maybe he didn't think he had anything to say to me. But when he's sitting there at the kitchen table, dying of cancer, and I can't say, I love you, something has been badly missing. And certainly now I tell my son I love him. He says he loves me, but there's a hole, there's an emotional hole that men need to learn to fill.
Right. That's why I'm bringing this up, and I'm really focusing on us as men. You wrote so touchingly and always eloquently about how your dad, on November 10 of 63, he left the hospital because he wanted to go on one last turkey shoot, and informed a whole club of his friends, and they took a picture in the shoot that you refused to be in. And in gripping detail, you spoke about how you regret that to this day. Was that two-part question? Was that your way of saying you wanted your dad to stay on this earth? You didn't want to take that final picture, and he passed away 3 days later. Please tell me you have pictures with your grandsons.
With my grandson?
Yeah, well, Jared and Jacob.
Yes.
So you have pictures with them. Good.
Yeah. And yes, absolutely. I have pictures with my son, but that was a moment, again, that was a moment when was that? That was 37, that was 58 years ago.
Right.
And I still feel that. I still know I stood off to the side, even when my mother and my sister were begging me to get in the picture. I refused to get in this picture. My dad was dying of cancer, sitting on a gurney, surrounded by maybe 25 or 30 of his best friends from the shooting club, and I would not get in the picture. And I asked a psychiatrist one time, why didn't I get in the picture? And he said, were you angry? Well, maybe I was angry. I was angry that he was gone before I knew him. I was angry that if I got in the picture, it was like, I'm okay with him dying. I wasn't okay with him dying, but I didn't know what to do. I just knew I didn't want to be in the picture. And now, of course, I wish I was in the picture. I would have that picture framed and in a place where I saw it every day. Instead, I'm not sure there's even a picture of me with my father.
Wow.
The only picture I have of me with my father, I was maybe 3 years old. And I'm working in a yard with him. He had just come home from World War II. He came home from the war in 1945. I was born in 41. There's a picture of me and him picking up leaves in the yard. Maybe the only picture I have. I have no adult picture of myself with my dad. So I think, and again, I mean, you've lived on the streets, you've worked on the streets, you know how many fractured father-son relationships cause problems.
Right.
Ours wasn't fractured; it just never existed. We never made it happen. So, fathers need to make it happen.
Right. And that's why I'm spending some time talking about this, because we as men do understand the fractured relationships that we can have with our fathers that cause problems for us and sometimes gets passed on to our sons. And that's why I think this is really important. And I want to get back to this a little bit, but also May 2013, Jared and May, hopped the train and they had left North Carolina, and Maggie had taken Jared to the hospital several times. He was having, alcoholic problems and seizures. And you got the call that Maggie and your grandson Jared had broken up. And I wanted to take the time to read this once again, fellas. This is for us. This is for the men out here, that we need to do better. You wrote when she told you that, and you believed in her, and you said that when she told me we broke up, I said too bad. I said nothing when I should have said everything. I had hoped they would trust me with their fears and dreams. I had hoped for more than grandsons could deliver, for I had been silent in my father's presence and my son had been silent in my presence. I'm a reporter. I ask questions for a living. For 50 years, I've asked questions that help people tell their stories when they didn't know they had a story to tell. And now my grandson's life is changing. I asked nothing, not a single damn question. I said only too bad. Now I hurt for all those questions unasked and fears unspoken. Close quote. I'm sorry for even having to read that, but I think it is so important for the men out there. We have to understand our obligation as fathers to talk and express. Out of all the traveling people that you spoke to concerning Jared, which one or two stood out the most to you and why?
Well, Maggie first. First above all, because she really cared about him. She loved him. She put her life on the line for him. And
Right.
So Maggie, is just such a darling, just a darling girl. Agro second, because Agro was probably the most articulate of the traveling kids that I met. She, of course, is in prison in California now, charged with murder, convicted of murder. She was one of 4 or 5 people who beat up a guy. Um, I exchanged letters with her, whole lot of the book, because Jared, again, I didn't know this about Jared's life until he was dead.
Right.
Almost everything in the book I know about Jared's life on the road, I learned after he was dead, from talking to his friends. And Agro was the most articulate. We probably exchanged 200 letters the time that she's been in jail about the life. And she was, of course, now she's a different person. She's been in jail for 5 or 6 years now. She's a changed person. She understands that the life that she led was not a life that anybody should lead, not a life that anybody should think is romantic in any way, not a life that anybody should aspire to. Uh, she understands that now.
Right.
But Maggie, Agro, the girls mainly, the women always seem to be more balanced, always seem to be kinder than necessary. The guys, most of the guys were not good people. Most of the guys were angry,
Right.
and expressed that anger in ways that were antisocial. Uh, Jared stood out among them because that was not him. He had a much more feminine side to him than any of them. And I say feminine in the sense of sentimental or soft
Right.
or kind. Uh, but Maggie and Agro, Booze Cop was a great friend of his for a long time. Uh, so they're unique people. They're unique people, and I loved them all. The ones that I met were all good, uh, but generally, I thought that they were good because of Jared's influence on them.
Right. Yeah. January 3rd, 2014, Jared was diagnosed at Episcopal Hospital with pancreatitis and inflammation of the pancreas that's usually caused by alcohol abuse. Left the hospital on January 15th, 2014. But on January 15th, 12/21, you received that dreaded call from the Philadelphia County Medical Examiner that Jared was gone. With all that you had been through within yourself, um, all the years, knowing that Jared had been suffering also over those recent years, what was in your gut when you got that call?
My son, the way it happened was that the coroner had called Lynn, the mother. Lynn called my son, Jeff. Jeff called us. It was 12:30 at night. My wife was watching television. I was in bed. She came to me and said, Jared died. It was one of those lines that is at once unbelievable, but you knew it was true.
Right, right.
That's where it was going. I felt empty. I felt completely empty. I was sad, crying, just felt that, I could have stopped this. I could have saved him somehow. I mean, I guess that's anybody's ego to think that you
Yeah,
could have
yeah.
done something. You
Right,
couldn't. Later I've now learned enough to know that I could not have done anything. I could not have saved him. I could have not have gone to South Carolina and convinced him to to quit drinking. I couldn't do it. Um, I now know that, but still, he was such a good kid. So much promise. That just goodness in him that was gone. The world was a lesser place without him,
right,
and mostly just this emptiness, just emptiness. I loved him in ways that I'd never loved anybody or anything, and so it's gone. And how do you get that back? And for me, as a writer, you know, get it back by doing this book. Hope that the book was hope the book accurately and honestly portrays who he was and what we loved about him, and that somebody can read this story and learn from it.
Right. Yeah, that's why you said in the preface for the book that you had written 1,000 stories about 1,000 people, but it had to have been difficult for you, and that's why I talk about your courageousness to be the storyteller for your grandson, especially when his lifestyle was so different from yours. It had to be complicated, but as you said, it was a story that you had to write. But man, I commend you for having the heart and the intestinal fortitude to write this story.
Well,
You know,
as I said, I couldn't not do it. I couldn't not do it. Just could not do it.
every year in the country, you had in the book also, there's thousands, almost 1 million deaths a year caused by alcohol. And so many people in the family and their friends, their lives are diminished by the loss of their loved ones. And it's just, I want to read something also that's here on page 96. And I think this is real key. And it's from a book, Clean, Overcoming Addiction and Ending America's Greatest Tragedy by David Sheff.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the effects of alcohol on the brain. And I really think that this is important for family members to hear, because I know when I was going through this with my family, had no clue. But he wrote, when drugs are withheld, the brain goes into kind of a shock. The system is starved for dopamine and other neurotransmitters. It's not quite obvious as serious. It's not quite as obvious as serious as oxygen deprivation, but it can feel like that, as if death is imminent. In distress, the entire body system now has one purpose: to return to equilibrium by finding more drugs to stimulate dopamine flow. Addicts can feel as if they're fighting for their lives, and they may be. Cells are dying, neurons are misfiring, which can cause tremors, nausea, anxiety, hallucinations, fever, and disorientation. But that's not all. The heart rate can rise dangerously, and the addict has a risk of seizures, which are sometimes fatal. Detoxing from alcohol is particularly dangerous. Close quote. I just wanted to put that out there because there are so many questions. For me personally, I was already a cop, Dave, and I had this ex-girlfriend. I didn't know that she had this major drug problem, and I became very close, especially with her mother. And I used to go with her mother, even though I wasn't seeing her. Her mother would call me because the father, he had pushed away. He didn't want to deal with it anymore. He had totally pushed away. The mother, being the mother, she'd call me 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning to please go with her to these tough sections of Bridgeport to look for her daughter on the streets. And I would always go with her. And the things you see was amazing for me, even as a cop. I had seen a lot, but it was just amazing to see that world. But I naively, she wouldn't stay in her parents' house, and I was trying to detox her myself. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I stayed with her. She was in my room. I locked her. When I had to go to work, I would lock her in the room. She would climb out the window. She'd climb out the window and leave. But I just learned about the ups and the downs and the trials and tribulations. Here I was, this big time cop who was doing all these things. In this situation, I was like a 4-year-old, because I didn't know the power of what she was fighting against. And that's why I really wanted to read that paragraph.
Yes.
Because I know there's a lot of families out there that go through that hopelessness and helplessness and feeling like they should be doing more. And like you said a couple of times, it's really hard because they're going to do what they want to do. When it comes, if they want to change, they have to want to do it.
Well, and what you just read is what you just read is what I didn't know at the time, certainly. I mean, they feel like they're dying, and the pain of the detox is what they want to avoid. What's
Right.
going to save them, a detoxification, they think is going to kill them.
Right. Yep. Exactly. I just also wanted to tell you that whole situation on page 221, where the cop gave the ticket. Your son was messed up on the street of New Orleans, and he gave him a ticket instead of arresting him for tumultuous behavior. And that kind of opened your eyes because you wanted him to go in, get caught in, and get some help. But police departments, they don't do that, especially when they know they have all these chronic problems. They don't want to pay overtime. They don't want to, because they know they're going to take the person to the hospital. And like the cop told you, which I thought was real shitty, that it was just so much paperwork. It
Yeah,
was just easy for him to get credit to get a damn ticket rather than to try to do something to assist this person, just as a former cop. That was bullshit. I always hated that mentality that some people had. Cops are not, just being too lazy and just trying to get a little credit without doing their best to help somebody else.
yeah.
I'm just telling you from a former cop, that just ticked me the hell off. Last thing I wanted to say, on the preface, you wrote so many poignant things, so many heartfelt things. I don't know if you feel the emptiness of your own loss, but I'm positive that you feel the emptiness of some family members who are going to see this, who have suffered through the same ordeals and wondered about the same questions that you did. And they constantly come up with no answer. I'm sure that you've answered some questions or you've opened some eyes and soothed some people by writing this book and saying you're not alone. You can't put a gauze on the wounds of broken hearts to this never-ending loss. I can't say enough about your courageousness in writing the book, and I'm sure your parents and your wife are proud of you, man. It's just such a big deal what you did with this book.
Well, thank you very much for that. Um, I believe that's true. I've heard from a lot of people that have said similar things, and I'm very happy that if it helps somebody, I just want people to know that just love them, just
Right.
love them.
Right. Another thing on page 142 in Chef's book again, I highlighted where you said he had this quote. He said, "Addicts aren't weak, selfish, or amoral. They're ill." Close quote. And I think that's very poignant. My friend David Kindred, thank you very much for your time today and for your honesty in writing this seminal book. Leave out the tragic parts. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about its quarter as much as I have.
Bobby, thank you for this. Thank you for everything you've said about the book. Thank you for supporting the idea of the book and understanding why I did the book. I don't take any credit for being courageous in writing this book. I could not, literally, I could not do it. I mean,
Right.
it would be the regret of my life if I had let this go without what I hope does is honors Jared, tells people that he was a good kid, that the idea that he was immoral or a character flaw, no, that wasn't him. He didn't choose addiction. Addiction chose him. And I needed to hope people understand that these are not bad people. These are people that bad things have happened to, and they don't know how to get out of it. We
Well,
need to
might as
help
well.
them.
Right. Your book is exactly what your dear wife Cheryl wanted it to be. It was a love story. Great job, Dave. Family, thanks for
Thank.
always supporting your show and mine, Bobby Ramos Bottom Line. I don't want to be a man of power, but I do want to be a man of purpose. Thank you for this time, your time. Until next time.
My name is Muhammad, and here's the latest. Turn up your radio, because you got the greatest. You know I can talk, man, I got the word. You listen to my man, Bobby. Forget about Joe Frazier, Sonny Liston, forget about all of them. Those are just pretenders. The real man, Bobby. Don't mess with him, man. He got the jab, he got the look, he got it all. He can dance. He's something special, man. He is the greatest of all time.